second episode of Renew Kids on the Block, the podcast about all things Renew. My name's Dan James, and I'm host of the podcast. I would like to introduce my co-host and my guest for the evening.
Hi, I'm Blaise Baquiche. Hi, my own personal background is that I'm one of those unelected Eurocrats. Spent 2 years out in Brussels, mainly advising Tory politicians. And if you think it's mad out here in Westminster, you have no idea what's going on in Brussels. It is a nightmare.
Hi, it's Annabel, and I was very lucky to be the first guest on the very first podcast, and so I'm very grateful to be invited back to be chatting again today.
So, let's start off just talking a little bit about kind of what's gone on over the last week, 2 weeks. These days,
Valentine's Day.
Well, yes, happy Valentine's Day indeed. Big red heart in the shape of another defeat this afternoon. It seems these days, of course, a week or two in politics is about 6 months worth in any other year, but here we are. So, Annabel, you were down at Parliament Square today, is that right?
Yep, yeah. I was just going to say, I feel like Brexit, I should get Brexit Botox because of the lines that it has given me. Today it was good. There was a relatively small crowd in comparison to some of the other protests. There was a lot of buzz, though, around different people who haven't been there before, basically saying this should be meaningful. Why is it not meaningful? Why are you not giving our representatives a meaningful say on what's happening today, as you promised us? Why are you pushing the can down the road yet again?
So, in your view, what do you think a meaningful vote would or should look like? What would we like to see on it?
Well, I mean, from our perspective, we'd like to see a meaningful vote which returns to the people to say, you know what, you asked for this, this is what it could potentially look like. You've been shown the sort of details around what an agreement might be. You've been given the other side of the story in terms of we could leave without an agreement. And now, what do you want? That is really what would be meaningful, actually. And you know, it really should return to the people because it is so significant for generations.
So, I agree with that, and I would love to see it come to that. I think one of the risks, and I'd love to hear what you guys think, of course, is that there is, I fear, a very real risk that if that ever did happen, we might not win. It might not go the way we'd like it to.
Yeah, and we were just saying, actually, looking at some of the advertising that's been going on Facebook, and people were complaining that they hadn't seen enough of Renew, and, you know, we're putting in hundreds of pounds a month into our Facebook advertising, but compared with some of the Leave campaign, who are putting in, you know, hundreds of thousands. And so there is a great deal of traction there, and we just can't compete at that level at the moment because we don't have that kind of funding. And so, yes, and they've already got some good taglines. What we don't want to do is fall into the same trap that we did before with the wrong kind of message and one that doesn't pull on the heartstrings.
Well, it all really depends on what's actually on the ballot paper. If there's no deal on the ballot paper, we will be staring into the abyss. I mean, with all this palaver going on about how the Labour Party is going to split, the Tory party itself has split into two parts with the ERG, and then the ERG has split in itself. And the hardcore right of the ERG are mental. You haven't officially mentioned whether I could swear on this podcast or not. But should I be myself?
Yeah, let's fly.
So to continue on from my introduction.
Stay on this side of my belly is slander.
Yeah,
but
I was gonna say it's not a nightmare in Brussels. It's an absolute shit show. And the ERG, back in Westminster though, the hardcore right of it will push us off a fucking cliff, and they don't care. So when it comes to influencing the majority of the population, or whichever percentage of the British population who has to win this second people's vote, if you put to them, do you just want anarchy? Do you want your life to change in any particular way? It doesn't really matter if it gets better or if it's worse. Do you want change? They would probably go for a no deal. No deal is scary, but it's a real possibility.
And the sad and scary thing to me is some of the short-sightedness. So we probably have all seen that clip of the guy whose son worked for, I believe it was Airbus, and and he voted, the father that is, voted for Brexit, and they're saying, well, like, your son's probably going to lose his job as a result of this. And he went, well, yeah, but voted Brexit for me, not for him. And one of the mystifying, absolutely, like, I don't understand how we got here thing, is how people like those who sit on the ERG were able to convince the public that this was somehow, that they're of the people, and this was for the people. And of course, all the Jacob Rees-Moggs of the world with their investment firms are going to do just fine, because if you're rich enough, you can basically make money off any crisis. And yet all of the people who are in the heartland, all of the people who voted in mass numbers for this are the ones that are going to be kicked in the balls for it.
But I suppose it's that, and because we've got leavers who are starting to join the party, and they say to us, the reason that I voted that way is because I looked to change, and I looked to good change, and you're telling me I'm going to get control, you're telling me it's going to be better, and I'm going to get more money for the things that matter to me, and health is a really big issue. I'm going to vote for that. Why would I not? But then, of course, the reality is that change isn't happening, it isn't occurring. And so our sort of message, which is all about, actually we can help to create radical change within the political system, which we believe will have better effects on all the things that really matter, is something that is resonating in a similar way. So it's quite, it's quite interesting that.
Yeah, and I think that touches on something that I've noticed a lot. One of the critiques that you get when you run into someone who is a leaver but not a mad foaming at the mouth leaver is a lot of people say, oh, you just think, and this is also actually people who voted Remain but are on the side of will of the people, basically. Oh, the decision's been made. Is you go, oh, you just think of the people who voted Leave were stupid. I go, no, I don't think they're stupid, but people aren't. We don't know all the political implications of every decision. We trust politicians to some extent to be experts in this. That's the point of a representative democracy. And so when the experts come out and they say, look, you're going to get £350 million a week and you're going to get back control and WTO terms this and easy frictionless trade that and the border problem will solve itself somehow because of magic technology fairies, then you kind of go, well, that sounds compelling. And it's not saying people are stupid. It's saying when massively, as you say, Annabel, very well-funded campaigns craft very well-articulated messages that are lies, I don't think somebody's stupid for believing it. I think there was a lot of science put into that.
When you mention fairies, it makes me think of Grayling's, next scandal and failing Grayling and his, I like to call it I believe in fairies, because that sort of feels like where we are with him.
Yeah.
If you believe enough, like you do in Brexit, you might actually get some fairies for these companies that you know.
But his main presence there is the scandal, surely.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, if we, having ridden Southern Rail for many years and seen the effects of some of his decisions on it, I'm not sure I would trust him to do very much at all.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I would put it this way, I'm not sure I would trust him to be the door guard who pushes the button to open the doors.
I mean, as a magistrate, he's basically decimated the criminal justice system, and I entirely blame him for it, really, because it's in such a shocking state. It is amazing that he's then given another position that allows him to do damage. I don't know what he holds on May, but I hope it's really, really good.
I'm sure it'll all come out in the memoirs.
Yeah.
Well, we talk about the Renew Party and actually renewing politics, but it just seems that perhaps the key criteria of being in government today is being incompetent. I don't know what qualifications. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to get involved with the Renew Party, because I would watch TV and I thought, well, anybody could do it. Sorry to set the bar so low. Sorry, I mean, not to take anything away from the hard work that you guys are doing here, but surely, what has happened? You've got to listen to this debate between Roy Jenkins and I think it was Tony. Who's Tony? Yeah, it was Hilary Benn's father, Tony Benn, and they were debating whether we should join the European Economic Community in the first place. And you can listen to the standard of the debate and the quality of information that they have at their fingertips, and the fact that they're actual statesmen. And now we don't really have any of that. So in the past 40 years, that's one of the questions we need to ask ourselves. What has happened?
I think the biggest thing to me is that somewhere along the way, and I don't know why exactly it happened, I don't know how exactly it happened, but somewhere along the way, I think politicians lost sight of what their job actually was, which is that politicians should be first and foremost a public servant. That's your job, is you serve the public. It shouldn't be about self-aggrandizement. It shouldn't be about building a prestige and accumulating power. That what it should be about is serving the public and serving the country. And that means sometimes making difficult decisions. That means sometimes making career-ending decisions. But if you do the right thing, if you actually lead, then that's what you're there to do.
Yeah, but I mean, there's also the reality is that we've got 1.6% of the population now belong to political parties, and that is your candidate pool. It's a tiny candidate pool, and actually, whether the catch-22 is people don't want to get involved in politics because it demands so much of your life and so much of who you are, but we actually need to encourage and make the barriers to entry different. We need to reduce them so that people feel that they can be part and parcel of this process, and that it doesn't, you don't. Maybe we can set different parameters around the social media. Maybe you don't have to expose your family. Maybe you don't have to feel, because then it makes it more enticing for people. And the sort of, the confidence that you need, the change of lifestyle that it requires, all of those elements, I think, are part of the issues. Voting at 11 o'clock at night. I mean, it's ridiculous.
And I think there has to also be a social change where right now the trust. It's why I laugh every time I hear Theresa May talking about, if we do X, if we don't Brexit, then people are going to lose their faith in the political system. And I'm like, Theresa, you just spent 2 years destroying what little faith people had. There wasn't that much to begin with, and you've really clobbered it. But putting that aside, it reminds me a bit of, there's a quote, there's a filmmaker I'm a big fan of named Kevin Smith, and I saw an interview with him where he was talking about some producer he'd worked with who was really incompetent, and he had this great line where he said, in Hollywood you just kind of fail upwards, and sometimes it sort of feels like that's the direction our political system's gone. But the social change I think has to come is not only that we should have faith in the politicians, but to some extent we should not necessarily venerate, but we should be to some extent in awe. If you look at somebody like not to be overly cliche, but someone like Churchill, who had this amazing rhetoric and this amazing vision.
He's a villain,
and
according to John McDonnell.
I mean, there are some very dark aspects to Churchill's reign, but putting that aside, that was someone who had grand ideas. And I remember back when George W. Bush was elected, back in the heady days when he thought that was the worst, when we all thought that was the worst president we would ever see. This whole thing about this big bit of support where people are like, he just seems like a guy you could have a beer with. And I'm like, then have a beer with him. Don't put him in charge of 5,600 active nuclear warheads. And we've somehow lost this idea, and there's been a general decline, I think, in this idea, faith in science, and we've seen the effects that has, whether it's anti-vax or global warming denial or whatever else, that this idea, we're done with experts, is just bonkers. And I watched The West Wing, and that's what I want in a politician, someone who is so intelligent that they think on a different level to anyone I've ever met. And we've lost the drive for that to be our governing body, and we want it to be 140 characters shouted out across the web and nothing else.
I think that's also part of the way the structure of the system currently works. So, MPs now are dealing with local issues. I don't want them to deal with local issues. I want them to be visionaries for the future. I want them to be creating the New Deal and what that New Deal looks like and how that, whether that's an education boost or whether that's how we deal with the AI within the education, how we create the creativity that we're going to need that's going to be our USP, how we deal with all that. But if you're having to deal with somebody can't get a flat on the local level because your local councillors aren't working well enough, then that is a problem, because those people, those MPs, should be thinking about the bigger, broader picture 20, 30 years down the line. But politics, of course, only rewards you for the next 4 years.
So see, that's interesting, because I would disagree with that. I actually think the local issues are also important. I think you have to represent both. I think that saying we want to have the big issues is really important, but at the same time saying, look, in my area, poverty is a huge problem, or there's real problems with integration from different people in different parts of the world, and I want to make sure that the bills respect that as well. I'm elected by those people, and I want to make sure.
But maybe that's part of the vision that you have the conversation on, but you're having it on a level which is about a national vision, rather than your councillors, which should be dealing with the local nitty-gritty. But the
Yes.
problem is, of course, the councillors also only come from 1.6% of the population who are self-selecting in. And because it's not paid very well and because it's not professionalised, to my mind, you lose a lot of people who, won't want to get involved because A, they couldn't afford to for family reasons or whatever, but also they then haven't got the capacity to deal with some of the quite serious issues and very vulnerable people you're often dealing with at that level. I think it's a bit lazy and bloated on sort of all levels, really.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think you're right. In terms, there's an interesting debate, and this is one I don't know where I land on around the MP salary, and there's always outcry every time MPs vote to increase their salary, and there's a part of me that goes, yeah, that obviously that's kind of marking your own homework, and I mean, if I had the opportunity to vote to increase my salary at my job, I would super do that, and I understand why there's outrage as a result, but at the same time, I'm just like, well, don't we want to attract the best? And if somebody who is an economic expert can go, I can make I think it's about 78 grand a year, I believe, for an MP. I can make 78 grand a year as an MP, which is fine. Or I can go work for Goldman Sachs and make 300 grand plus a bonus. They have to be a very dedicated public servant to say, no, I'm going to turn down that additional 222 grand a year in order to go be an MP, and putting aside the grueling campaign and all the rest. And so that's one where I really kind of go back and forth, because you do want the best of the best, and you do want those illustrious people and the most intelligent.
There we go. I mean, reform in all aspects, really, and even administrative, constitutional reform. For example, I mean, you mentioned the MPs voting at 11 o'clock at night, because it takes 10 minutes for one vote. And this was something that Caroline Lucas was banging on about. Yeah, in the European Parliament, it would have taken 10 seconds. Less. And so, I mean, I don't know, all these archaic systems, the fact that you had, was it Rupert Hook? Or it was somebody else who was pregnant, who wasn't. Sadiq. Tulip Sadiq, who wanted to vote by proxy or to postpone her cesarean. She couldn't. She had to be pushed through a wheelchair. And the fact that we were so head over heels over the changes that were happening in that. One of the MPs was breastfeeding in the chamber. Breastfeeding? Are you telling me that a baby needs food to survive? What are you talking about? It seems like there needs to be reform on a psychological level in terms of the minds of the people who are actually in the House of Commons, as well as the administration, as well as everything.
Yeah, the funny thing about Tulip Sadiq is she was actually offered someone else to vote for her. But the problem is nobody trusts the system anymore. Because
the Tories reneged on it.
Exactly.
The shithousery done by
Which was
Graham Brady.
shameful.
Yeah, it's outrageous. So now you can't even trust that system. So, I mean, you're right. Yeah. But I often think that actually the building in itself, whilst it is a beautiful building, and I love the ceremonial aspect, it is the least useful modern building for political debate. I mean, it's properly adversarial,
Yeah.
One side versus the other, and you are like this at loggerheads, rather than a sort of, I don't know, I suppose actually the European Parliament's really.
Yeah, that's based on all other European systems, and I don't know if it definitely makes for a more conducive environment in making policy, but the Westminster system, well, as you could see, it's just broken. And do we actually get anything out of it? Everybody talks about how it's full of hot air and it's a talking shop, and nothing happens in the European Parliament. They're all lazy. Great YouTube clip by Dan Hannon, who was actually saying, yeah, if only we were actually lazy, if only we we read a book or increased our golf handicap or did something other than meddle in the lives of ordinary European citizens. You can't believe that he's saying this. He's an MEP paid for by the European taxpayer, and because he's so committed to the ideology of Brexit, he just doesn't care.
Well, so that's something that I was talking about earlier with somebody around the fisheries. So Farage was there, meant to be representing those guys within those meetings, I think 43 of which he turned up for one. So he was meant to set the British agenda for what we wanted. Presumably, because of his absence, it played into his whole thing of we have no power within the situation, and it played into his message. So he basically screwed them twice. So he's
That's my Farage impression. But
he screwed them in the chamber, and then he's now screwed them because they're not going to get what they think they're going to get, and it's all because of his mission.
Exactly. I think you could. The money I would pay for a researcher to go out there with a PowerPoint slide and just say, "Here's what you could have done for the UK during your 20 years in the European Parliament, if you had attended at least one of however many meetings." But no.
But I think he's emblematic of the set of a lot of Leave voters in the UK, a lot of Trump voters in America, who are just angry, and they see the same problems that we have just discussed, and they say, look, the system is broken in this way, and the system is broken in that way. But whereas we say, look, we want to reform it, we want to try to bring about positive change, there is a group of people who just say the system is broken, I want to burn it down, I want to wipe the slate clean, and anything is better than what we've got. And I think a lot of Brexit vote was around screw Westminster, screw the elites, and how you go from
Get
screw
on
the
with
elites
it.
to I'm going to vote for what Boris and Jacob Rees-Mogg told me to do is a bit of a mental leap, but fine. But I think that's that's Farage's whole shtick, right? Is I'm just going to, I hate the EU, but I'm going to run as an MEP, and then I'm going to win, and then I'm going to do nothing because I'm just trying to put
Break the system.
I'm trying
And
to
I'm
put
going to claim that
stick in
none
the
of you
cogs.
have ever had a proper job in your lives. I
Did you
mean,
see the great picture of that with the guy who was a neurosurgeon
Yeah,
behind
yeah,
him,
yeah.
rolling his
Yeah,
eyes?
born in a Soviet gulag.
Yeah.
Yeah. The irony
Donald
is,
Tusk, the Polish
exactly.
freedom fighter.
The irony, the painful irony, is not lost on people, but he's there still. He carries on, and whatever happens with his new Brexit party, from which he's disassociated himself within the first 5 days
Has he?
already. Yeah.
Oh, I hadn't read
Yeah.
that. Oh
Yeah.
my
I
goodness.
missed that as well.
Yeah.
Well, because I mean,
There was some weird thing where they were using the wrong phrase
Well,
or
no,
something.
it wasn't hard to dig up all this dirt on what the new head of operations of this new Brexit party had said in the past, namely, "I'm not racist. I have a Jamaican husband," and then went to hustings with a framed photo of her husband.
Wow.
Okay.
It's like the American congressman who tried to disprove global warming by bringing a snowball onto the floor, as if you're just like, yeah, no, but what's the thing from Game of Thrones where they say anything before the word "but" doesn't count? So I'm not racist, but doesn't matter.
But it is, you're right, there's this sort of thing that actually nothing is better than anything that we have now. Literally nothing. And there's actually, you think it's more of a sort of libertarian, like actually let's strip it right back to its bare bones and we'll have nothing. We'll have no state interference whatsoever, which is really almost where it's headed in so many ways.
Well, and that's it. And I think it's not even just libertarian. It's more. So I talked to a guy once who identified himself as an anarcho-capitalist, which is like
Dan Hannan.
the loony wing of libertarian. Yeah. And I got a debate to him, which ultimately went down to me telling him, listen, if you really want anarcho-capitalism, you can do that. That exists right now. Go to Mogadishu. That's what it is. Congratulations. And I think it's another thing that's just baffling to me, right? And so I did both throughout my undergrad and through my PhD, I did competitive debating. And in competitive debating, the theory and the way that it's judged is people who make the better, more compelling arguments ultimately win the day. And I remember we did a debate once that was just kind of a tongue-in-cheek, does God exist debate, right? And it was a bit of a way to kind of raise publicity, did a big public one. And the problem was it didn't work as a debate because one side is going, look, here's all this evidence, da-da-da, and the other goes, yeah, fine, but I have faith, and therefore your evidence means nothing to me, or lack of evidence. And it fundamentally didn't work as a debate because you were arguing from different points of view. And that's fine in that case because religion is obviously a very personal thing and okay. However, as a debater, as someone who believes in the power of rhetoric and logic, I don't know how to react to somebody where you say, here's a bunch of evidence, and they either say, nah, I don't believe it, or, yeah, that's true, but I don't care. When you go like, £100 billion a week is the government's own estimate for how much worse off we're going to be. And they go, yeah, but it's worth it because we're going to take back control. And you go, we're really not, because we're still going to have to trade with the EU, and the only way that's going to happen is if we adhere to their regulations.
I mean, in the Brexit context, that's all Project Fear. And so some of the arguments against that...
Project Fear is just British for fake news.
It's
exactly the same message.
Yeah. But it's that we wouldn't be so stupid as to do that. I think you're really overestimating or underestimating how dumb we can actually be.
Yeah, and there is a tiny little part of myself, not the big part, but there's a tiny little part of myself that is so frustrated with that lack of logic and with that lack of understanding that I want to just go, you know what, fine. Let's no deal, and I'm going to come back to each one of your houses 5 years from now and be like, hey, remember when you had electricity? Gee, wasn't that great, jackass? By the way, I've got a Canadian passport, my wife has an Irish one, so I'll be visiting you from Dublin, the new financial capital of the world. And obviously that's not actually like that, it's clearly not going to go that bad, and clearly there isn't, that my hope is not actually that, but there is a little part of me that just kind of the schadenfreude a bit wants to just see, you know what, fine, you guys really want this? Okay. It's like the parent that lets their kid grab the birthday candle so they learn that it's hot and it burns, only this particular burn will last 60 years and 8.3 trillion pounds.
The Dutch press are having quite a lot of fun at our expense at the moment, and the front page of the website, which is the Brexit preparation website, is actually a picture of a Muppet. And it's a subtle Dutch humour about, well done, guys, you've really, screwed yourself.
Well, I saw a Reddit thread that was saying that apparently the Swedish anti-EU party now officially says they want to remain inside the EU.
Yes.
And on the Reddit thread, the top comment was somebody from Sweden saying, "Dear Britain, thank you." Because, man, have we showed how bad an idea that is. And my understanding is that that's not uncommon, that most of the big all the Grexit and the, I don't know what the Dutch one was called, Duxit, Nedexit, Frexit, all of these groups have kind of gone suspiciously quiet. They're like, yeah, maybe things aren't so bad.
In fact, the French far right, they have also said that they want to stay in the EU, and I can't think of her name, but
Marine Le Pen, her lot.
Yeah. They've all decided that actually
National
it's
Front
better.
or something
they
like
wanted
that.
to get rid of the euro as well, but that just doesn't make any sense for them.
Well, yeah, and this is the thing. I can understand people who say Europe is too bureaucratic and it's too wasteful and it's a big bully and it's a da-da-da-da-da and all these things, but I'm like, yeah, but if they're big and strong and bully and they're throwing their weight around, shouldn't we be with them? Like, in the very worst case scenario, shouldn't we accept that Europe is a necessary evil? Even if you don't like them, it's still better to work with them than on the opposite side of the table.
Yeah. And I mean, how much more bureaucratic and how much more wasteful is it than any other national parliament?
Well, yeah.
Well, but also, I mean, the big lie was, yay, it's all going to get rid of all this red tape. And of course, actually, it's going to at least double it. I mean, but I remember having conversations about that before the referendum and people going, ha, you don't know what you're talking about. And I was thinking, okay, maybe I mean, I'm not a trade expert, but I'm pretty sure that this makes sense to me. Just logically, this makes sense. You can see this going to happen. But I mean, it was like the Irish situation. And it was quite interesting because we were talking about it in the office and most of the guys are in their early 20s and don't remember a time when bombs were ever present. And I grew up with them because I'm older. And, that thought of the Irish situation kind of coming again is absolutely horrifying to me because it littered my childhood, these memories of the bombs and the attacks, and you felt it really strongly. And it's interesting, and then the guys went and did a bit of research, and the reality of that is really horrifying.
And it's unfathomable. So I only moved to the UK in 2005 from Canada, and it's, I heard about it as a kid. I knew about the Troubles. I knew about Northern Ireland. as a rough place and where there was all this going on in kind of an abstract way. But having lived here and having spent a fair amount of time in Dublin through various work trips and so forth, and a smaller amount of time in Belfast, I cannot picture what that's like. I think, I just look around and I see, okay, yes, I know there are still simmering tensions. One of the things I've been most impressed with is that every now and again somebody tries to stir a bit of shit up. There was a police officer who was assassinated by some fringe paramilitary group about 2 years ago. And I remember seeing, the whole community came together and was like, no, we do not do that. We are not going back down that road, and just shut it down. And there was no revenge. There was no nothing. There was reconciliation. And anytime somebody goes, oh, Brexit's worth it, Brexit, whatever, or a no deal is better than a bad deal or whatever, I want to just say, what is your answer on Ireland? Just give me something that isn't based on technology that doesn't exist. Okay, you guys are going to vote this down, you're going to vote that down. What's your answer? Even if nothing else, even if you think we can negotiate our way around 726 trade deals that we're going to need for the world, I believe was the estimate to replicate the EU, even if you find, okay, we can deal with fisheries, even if you're happy, let's be honest, basically ceding Gibraltar to Spain, which is what's going to happen, even if you're happy with all of that somehow, what's your answer on Ireland? And all of these guys, whether it's Johnson, whether it's Rees-Mogg, whether it's Gove, whether it's Davis, any of these guys who have done nothing but dig their heels in like petulant children and just say, no, not good enough, no, not good enough. None of them has come up with a single constructive answer.
I mean, you mentioned debating, but are you familiar with the art of the bullshitter?
Yeah.
Because all of the time...
I've had 2.5 years of witnessing.
Well, there we go. And I mean, people like Dr. Liam Fox has managed to get... has managed to get to the position that he is in basically through a lifetime of bullshit. Because what he knows about international trade deals can be written on the back of a postage stamp and still leave room for the Lord's Prayer. That's something I want. That's my platitude for question time if I'm ever invited on. Yeah. But I mean, when I mentioned before about what happened in the past 40 years in terms of the debate and the discourse and the quality of our politicians, where were the fact checkers? Where were the people to call out bullshit? Perhaps there could be a reintroduction of that somehow, where we actually hold our politicians to a higher account.
Well, I mean, we were talking about one of our reforms is to introduce a kind of advertising and marketing standards agency, but for politics. So you put out an ad, somebody goes, hang on a minute, that's not right, and it gets pulled because of that, and you get a fine. Done. I mean, it's actually a really simple system. You could add it onto the Electoral Commission. We had a new candidate who joined us yesterday and was approved yesterday, and she was telling me about something where she is, and she's in Maidenhead, which is obviously a fun seat to be in. And somebody had put up a massive banner, and it was the local council, and they were saying that they had built X number of new homes. Little asterisks underneath, tiny letters, going to build, not actually done it yet. And it was like, so they're making this enormous giant claim in these huge letters, asterisk, and you'd never be allowed that in advertising. I mean, that's for false selling. I mean, it's just amazing.
And I think it has to, and there's a certain amount of latitude that I'm willing to give people. Yeah. So when people make campaign promises and they get elected and it turns out either the situation changes or actually when you're in government you get access to the numbers and the budgets and whatever, this just isn't going to work. I have some sympathy for that. That's fine. But when you just spout inaccuracies and knowingly do so...
But Brexit has been referred to as a contract between the people and Parliament. But as you all well know, any contract that has particularly onerous terms, of which one of the parties is unaware, is automatically void. So this is the classic case with... clicking accept for iTunes whenever you want to download something, or with Facebook or something.
The biggest lie on the internet is I have accepted the terms. I've read and accepted.
But it's all meaningless. But I mean, they'd call it a contract. It's not really. When it comes to Brexit, I'd love to whip out some statute law and say, no, what contract was this? What bullshit did you spout out this time?
When your entire constitution is based on nothing written down, maybe there's the same issue, you know, and the reform of that.
Change a written
Yeah.
constitution.
Yeah.
If Scotland votes for independence, then surely that must be the wake-up call that we need a written constitution.
Yeah. But also, what about much more local powers? I mean, I think that's something I feel really strongly about is a devolved government. But the devolvement has to be around. So your region here, you go choose what your devolved power looks like. What about a Yorkshire Parliament? I mean, is it so ridiculous to think about it? You know, you could change the way the councils work. You could amalgamate them into regional entities, and then, I mean, you know, we could just open up the whole debate to a completely different perspective.
And it's interesting because, again, as a Canadian, that's not far off. We have a federal system. Now, we're not as, the powers aren't devolved as much as they are in the US. One of the fundamental differences between Canada and the US politically is the states have so much more power individually to change it. But in Canada, there's still a fair amount. There's a transfer from the federal government, from federal income tax to each of the provinces to fund education and healthcare and so forth. But how that's actually delivered varies a lot from province to province, because, I mean, Canada obviously is very different depending which province. So if you're in one of my favorite stats is the three territories, so the three northern territories in Canada have a combined area 16 times the size of the UK and a combined population of 105,000. Delivering education in that scenario is very different from doing it in urban Toronto. And so the same answer isn't going to work. Delivering healthcare. I knew a guy who was a lifeguard at a pool in Nunavut, and he was like, I was terrified if anything ever happened because the nearest hospital is a 45-minute medevac helicopter away, each way. And so he's like, if somebody has a heart attack, I'm doing CPR for 45 minutes until the paramedics arrive, and then they're doing CPR for 45 minutes until they get him to the hospital. Wow. And so Canada's always had some level of devolvement. Now, not down to the sort of the city and the regional level, but down to the provincial level. And so that model has worked quite well, and you see it in some of the even just some of the day-to-day stuff. You know, the age at which you can drink varies from province to province. The age at which you can drive varies from province to province. Some of those little things even vary. And I think that there is a lot of strength behind that notion. And I think we've seen places like Scotland and Wales where the devolution has been broadly a success and has been a very popular motion.
Well, but it's interesting. So the Conservatives always like to say that, you know, they only do the will of the people. They've asked loads of different parts of the country if they would like mayors. And generally, when the people have said no, they've gone on and given them anyway. You know, West Midlands is a really good example. So they don't actually ever really follow the will of the people. In fact, I think it's like in 8 of the circumstances, they enforced it. But it's an interesting model for the future and maybe the sort of city-state kind of idea and the way that might work, but with a whole sort of national agenda being the, you know, I just think there are so many different ways that we could do this and get this better. And the hope is that people feel more empowered because they feel that they have much more say in their area and their region. And it works for them rather than...
And it would probably help address some of the concerns around places like Sunderland feeling they've been left out of the political process, because they can say, well, hold on, we want to introduce these laws, and you still have to be careful, right? Because you don't want somebody to introduce local laws that say allow loads of pollution in order to entice manufacturing. But I think that it would give people that's a bit more of a sense of engagement. I think there is, as you say, there's a lot of isolation of Westminster, and people feel it's very far away. And as I said earlier, I think that was a lot of the cause behind Brexit. So I think there's a lot of legs to that party, to that policy.
We also did polling on mandatory voting, and it was really popular in our polling, which I was quite intrigued about.
Yeah, that's something I support, but I'd really want to read more about, because I know Australia does it, and I don't know what the effects have been.
It's pretty good for sort of those who usually don't vote.
And Italy does it.
Brazil does it too.
Yeah, and so then you end up with a nut
That
job
hasn't been so good.
as a protest vote.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd rather. I mean, wouldn't you rather the establishment over a right wing nut job?
I mean, I feel like we're there already.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
The other thing, that's a bit smaller than that, but I'd really like to see would be having voting day be a national holiday,
Yes.
so that you don't have to worry about childcare or your job. And
Well,
I think
they are open until 10 in the.
they're open, yeah.
Shifts and child pick up and drop off, and I mean, I actually think a Sunday. Why not vote on Sunday? In France, they always did it weekends. I don't understand why we have to. It's always on a Sunday in France. You go to church, you go vote.
Although you've still got people, of course, who are working in shops and things
of
like
course.
that.
Yeah, or shifts, like when I
Yeah.
used to, But it does seem to obviously encourage more. But I mean, why not flexi voting on the on your app? I mean, digital democracy is really the future, isn't it?
It is.
It's
Though
blockchain.
I still want a
Isn't it
paper
gonna be
trail.
hacked by Russians? No.
Oh well, or
Right.
actually thinking back to the West Wing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some case
Yeah.
where there was,
Well, in the real world, there's a company in the States that trialed digital voting booths, and Siebold, I forget the exact name of it, but it was basically the CEO was a former Republican congressman, the executive chairman was a top Republican donor, and these things went in. They were based on 10-year-old versions of Windows, incredibly hackable, had no paper trail, and every time they were used gave suspiciously high results to Republican candidates. And so I'm fine. I'm a digital guy. I'm all for that. I still want somewhere to know that there's a paper trail that we can use as a backup.
Yeah, that makes sense, and you can make that part of the system.
Yeah.
What you don't want is somebody to have the passwords then die, like that poor bloke with the bank accounts
Yeah,
that did. He was
the
Canadian,
Bitcoin
wasn't
guy. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Terrible. 200 million sitting in the account somewhere.
Yeah.
Back on Canada, I think it actually took Jordan Peterson turning up on Question Time to tell me that Canada almost committed suicide over its referendum with Quebec twice.
Yeah.
Even
No, it was only once.
right. It tore the country apart.
Well, and it was interesting because, and this is something that actually, it doesn't even matter. No matter which way Brexit goes, the government has to do what the Canadian government did. So the Quebec referendum was very close. In fact, I think it might have been 48-52, if not, in fact, closer. Voted to stay. So it was very similar in a way to the Scottish referendum in that respect. But there was a lot of rancor and there was a lot of resentment on both sides. And the Canadian government spent a lot of money over the next sort of 4 or 5 years really investing in making Quebec feel included. So it was a lot of advertising campaigns. It was a lot of funding of various projects and public arts and all sorts of things like that to make it clear that we, the country, wanted Quebec to be part of it. Because similar to the Scottish referendum, similar to Brexit, outside of Quebec, there was an overwhelming support for Quebec to remain. And so there was a real effort of like, whoa, actually, we need to heal these wounds. This is a symptom of an underlying problem. And I desperately hope that no matter what happens, that is the next step. Because the saddest thing for me on the day after Brexit was feeling that I was so disconnected from my country, that there were people here who felt so angry and so out of the loop that I had no familiarity with because I'd lived in this London bubble and I didn't know anybody who was voting Leave. And we need to find some way, no matter which way this thing goes, to try to start healing some of those wounds.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that really impressed me when I first joined Renew was the fact that they'd been out and listened. And I think that is the start of all of that conversation, and just hearing what people have to say has to be part of that process to heal. I mean, we all at least have the same empathy level now because we all feel that we're in a foreign country in some ways. And having felt it for years, they're still angry, but we actually also feel in some ways.
Yeah.
And it's leveled in some ways the playing field a little bit.
Yeah.
And we can only work up from that.
Yeah, no matter how you feel about Brexit, we all hate the Westminster politicians as they stand now.
Yeah.
That's what really unites us as a
Yeah.
country, is screw those guys.
That could be our uniting cry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, vote Renew. We're better than that lot.
I was saying, however much you hate the European project or the European Parliament for that matter, yes, you can vote to leave it, but it's not really that much different from your own national parliament, but you can't vote to leave that.
Yeah.
Mm.
So it doesn't really make any sense unless we do what you're suggesting, and we actually do. We just get rid of all these politicians.
And change it in a completely different way and reform it totally. A revolution.
Indeed.
Starts here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was episode 2 of the Renew Kids on the Block podcast. I would like to thank my co-host Blaise and Annabel, our guest, for joining us today, as well as Angus, our producer. And we look forward to bringing you the next one in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much.